The boarding door had been closed for 4 minutes when the laughter started. It came from the forward galley, low and conspiratorial, the kind that travels through thin walls and thin curtains because nobody thinks the person they are laughing about can hear it. Adaize Okafor could hear it. She sat in seat 14C, a middle seat in economy, a canvas tote bag at her feet and a crumpled boarding pass in her hand, and she heard every word. 31F, one of them said. She went straight to 31F like she had a deed. More laughter. Someone said, "Did you see the look on her face when Marcus redirected her?" A third voice, softer. "She didn't say anything at all." The first voice again, certain and unhurried. "Not a word, just moved." Adaize pressed her back into the seat cushion. The seat cushion was standard economy, the foam compressed flat from years of use, covered in a blue-grey fabric that the airline updated every decade, and that always looked, regardless of the update, like it had been waiting to be replaced. Her hands were still. She had trained herself over many years and in many rooms to keep her hands still when she most wanted to move them. She looked straight at the seat, back in front of her. Pale blue fabric. A small scuff near the headrest latch. She focused on it. But before we get to what happened when the captain stepped out of the cockpit and read the manifest, let me take you back, because the woman in seat 14C did not arrive there by accident. And the flight crew laughing in the galley did not know yet whose name they were laughing at. What happens when they find out is what this story is actually about. Stay with me. Adaize Okafor grew up in a city that smelled like diesel and bread on the south side of Cincinnati, in a house that had been her grandmother's house before it was her mother's, and her mother's before it was hers. The house had a narrow kitchen with yellow tile, a back porch that listed slightly to the east, and a living room shelf that held 3 things: a framed photograph of her grandmother in her nursing uniform, a copy of the FAA Airman Knowledge Testing Supplement from 1991, and a model aircraft, a Boeing 737 that her grandmother had bought at a hobby shop in 1992 and painted by hand in the colours of an airline that no longer existed. Her grandmother, Nena Okafor, had spent 31 years as a charge nurse at Mercy Hospital West and had dreamed from the age of 9 of flying commercial aircraft. She had read everything she could find. She had attended an air show at Lunken Airport in 1961 and stood at the fence for 3 hours watching the aircraft depart. Her chin level, her expression composed with the same composure she would later teach her granddaughter, and she had memorized the engine sounds the way other children memorize songs. In 1968, she was told at the recruitment desk of 2 separate airlines that the positions were unavailable. She was not given a reason. She understood the reason. She came home and applied to nursing school instead. She never spoke bitterly about it. She spoke practically. She told Adaize, sitting on that listing porch in the thick of a July evening when Adaize was 7 years old, that the door had been blocked. Not locked. Blocked. There was a difference. A locked door means someone decided the room is closed, Nana said. A blocked door means someone decided you specifically shouldn't be in that room. Different problem. Different solution. Adaize had pressed her palms flat on the porch railing and looked at her grandmother. The porch boards were warm from the day's heat, even at 7 in the evening. A neighbour's radio played something slow and brass-heavy 2 houses over. These details she remembered precisely because the mind stores instruction differently than it stores ordinary conversation. This was not ordinary conversation. "What's the solution?" she asked. "You learn every inch of the room from the outside," Nana said, "so that when the blockage moves, you are the most prepared person waiting." Nana died in 2009. She left Adaize the model aircraft, the FAA manual, and a folded piece of paper on which she had written, in her precise nurse's cursive, the names of every female commercial pilot she had been able to find and document since 1973. She had been keeping the list for over 3 decades. She had cross-referenced newspaper archives, aviation industry publications she borrowed from the public library, and in her final years, the internet, which she had learned to use at 72 for this specific purpose. There were 41 names. At the bottom, below the last name, she had written in the same careful cursive, 42. Adaize was 19 years old when she received that piece of paper. She sat on the floor of her grandmother's now empty kitchen, the yellow tile cold through her jeans, and she read all 41 names twice. Then she enrolled in ground school the following spring. She took her private pilot certification examination at 22. Her instrument rating at 23, her commercial certificate at 25. She paid for each one herself, working first as a line cook at a breakfast diner on Reading Road, then as a hotel banquet server at the Hyatt downtown, then as a catering coordinator for a regional carrier out of Cincinnati. She studied in the catering commissary on her lunch breaks, sitting on an overturned milk crate with the sectional charts spread across a stainless steel prep table that the kitchen staff had cleared for her without being asked, because they had watched her set it up every day for 8 months and had understood, without discussion, that this was not optional study. This was a person building something. The other workers left her alone with it. They brought her coffee without interrupting her. A woman named Patrice, who worked the coal prep station, once covered a Daisy's brake extension without comment when a practice examination ran 20 minutes long. These small acts of witness she carried the same way she carried her grandmother's list, not as sentiment, but as fuel. She had filled 3 notebooks by the time she earned her commercial certificate. The notebooks were dark green, with cloth covers that warped slightly from being carried in pockets and bags, and she kept them not as diaries but as ledgers. Wind correction formulas, approach briefing templates, the mathematics of altitude and weight and fuel consumption compressed into a handwriting that grew smaller and more precise as the years passed, the way handwriting always does when the mind behind it stops wasting space. At 27, she applied to a regional airline. She submitted her application on a Saturday morning from the same commissary break room where she had studied, because the commissary had the best internet connection available to her at the time, and she had learned not to apologize for the circumstances of her access. She received a response 11 days later. The response was an interview invitation. She printed it on the commissary's shared printer, folded it to exactly the size of a boarding pass, and carried it in the same pocket where she kept the folded paper with 41 names until the day of the interview. She was hired as a first officer on the Embraer 175. She flew the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes routes, the short-haul runs that were weather-prone and operationally demanding in the particular way of flights that cannot divert easily and cannot carry large fuel reserves and must be flown precisely on every single leg or the accumulated errors compound. The pilots who flew those routes for 3 or 4 years came out the other side with a specific kind of competence that could not be simulated or taught in longer, more forgiving environments. She flew them for 4 years. She came out the other side. At 31, she transitioned to a major carrier. She was 29th in her new higher class of 32. She noted that. She noted the composition of the class. She did not speak about it. She flew the right seat on the 737 for 2 years, accumulating the hours and the line experience the carrier required before approving a type rating request. And she used those 2 years the way she had used the commissary, as a preparation environment for the next room. At 33, she began her Airbus transition. The A320 family was a different aircraft in philosophy as well as engineering, a fly-by-wire machine that managed inputs differently than anything she had previously flown, and she spent 6 months learning to stop flying with the intuitions she had built in the 175 and the 737, and to develop new intuitions calibrated to the Airbus logic. The transition was humbling. She recorded its specific difficulties in the dark green notebook with the precision she applied to everything: date, lesson, what she had assumed and why she had been wrong, what she understood now. 3 pages on side stick authority alone. 2 pages on the flight envelope protection system's behavior during a stall approach. She was not too proud to be a student again. She had been a student continuously for over a decade. At 34, she completed her type rating. The oral examination lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, longer than most because the examiner was thorough and because Adaze answered every question completely, including the ones where a shorter answer would have been acceptable because she had the full answer and she had earned the right to give it. She drove home from the testing centre in the dark with the temporary certificate on the passenger seat beside her, and she did not call anyone. She drove past the house on the south side, past the back porch that still listed east, and she sat in her car in the driveway for 7 minutes and looked at the front window where the shelf was and the model aircraft on it, barely visible as a silhouette at that hour. Then she went inside and called her mother. At 36, she held a line captain bid on the A321, the youngest black woman at her airline to hold that specific seat on that specific aircraft. She had told no one at the airline that she had begun this journey with a folded piece of paper and 41 names. She had told no one either that the model aircraft on her living room shelf, the one her grandmother had painted, which Adaiz had stripped and repainted herself at age 15 when the original paint had begun to chip, was still there. That she had stood in front of it the morning of her first captain's flight and pressed one finger against the forward fuselage, not for luck, but for instruction, the way you touch a thing to remind yourself that someone else's hands built it and it has already held the air. Now she was in seat 14C. She was in seat 14C because the company's scheduling system had pulled her original assignment 48 hours prior for a route change, and the rebooking algorithm had placed her in the only remaining available seat on the reissued itinerary. She was deadheading from Atlanta to Houston to pick up her afternoon flight. Deadheading was routine. It happened to every line pilot eventually, and the system that booked it had no mechanism for context, no field in the manifest that said, "This person belongs in a uniform," no flag that connected the passenger record to the crew database in a way that the gate agent would have seen unless the gate agent was specifically looking. The gate agent had not been looking. Marcus had not been looking. The laughter in the galley was the sound of what happens when no one looks. She had her crew credentials in the tote bag, her ID, her license, her type rating documentation. She had not presented them at the gate because the gate agent had not asked, and she had not volunteered information that was not being sought. This was a decision she had made consciously, not out of pride and not out of test-laying, but out of a principle her grandmother had given her in a different language on a different subject. You do not announce yourself to people who have already decided not to see you. You wait for the moment when the room cannot pretend anymore. At the gate, a flight attendant named Marcus, whose name she had read from his crew badge as she boarded, had redirected her from row 31 with a practiced pleasantness that was not quite rude and not quite respectful. The pleasantness was the kind that is deployed to manage without engaging, to redirect without accounting. He had looked at her boarding pass, glanced at the canvas tote and said, "You'll actually be back just a bit further," gesturing toward the economy section with one hand while his other hand reached for her boarding pass to perform an additional scan. He did not perform on the passengers ahead of her in line. He scanned it and handed it back and pointed again. She had looked at him for one moment, fully and without expression. He had not looked back with equal attention. She had moved. She had found 14C. She had sat. It was now 11:14 in the morning. Through the thin partition she heard one of them say, "3 bags, economy middle, not even an upgrade." The laughter reformed around that, quieter but no less certain of itself, the laughter of people who believe they are alone in a private room. She understood, with the clarity of someone who had been in many versions of this situation, that she could respond in exactly 2 ways. She could present her credentials now before departure and watch the laughter stop and the faces change and feel the brief, sharp satisfaction of a correction administered at close range. Or she could wait. She had learned over years of rooms that underestimated her that waiting was not the same as accepting. Waiting was the choice of a person who has done the arithmetic and understands that the later correction, the one that arrives when the room has fully committed to its error, lands with more weight than the early one. The early correction can be apologized around, smiled around, recovered from with minimal damage. The later correction has nowhere to go. It just sits there in the room with everyone, and everyone has to decide what to do with it. She chose to wait. The aircraft pushed back at 11:21. Standard taxi, standard lineup at the hold short line, 3 aircraft ahead, the departure queue running the slow rhythm of a heavy morning bank. She listened to the engine spool from below and felt it in the seat frame, familiar as her own heartbeat, a sound and vibration she had learned from the left seat and could no longer hear passively from any other position. The pitch told her the crew was on time, unrushed, running a normal departure on what was, from their side of the cockpit door, an unremarkable morning. She knew the Hartsfield departure procedures on this runway configuration. She knew the noise abatement turn and the altitude restrictions and the airspace geometry that made Atlanta departures complicated for pilots who hadn't flown them enough to hold the picture in their heads automatically. She knew it the way she knew most things about aircraft and airports, from study that nobody had asked her to do, from hours of approach plates and airport diagrams committed to a notebook by someone who understood that preparation in advance of need was the only preparation that counted. The line moved. 12:28. They were cleared to the runway. At 11:31, they were airborne. She closed her eyes for the first 4 minutes of climb. Not to sleep. To be precise about what she was feeling, because precision about internal states was a discipline she had developed alongside precision about external ones, and the two were not as separate as they were sometimes presented to be. What she found was manageable. There was a dry heat in her chest that she recognized as controlled anger, the kind that doesn't need to express itself because it has already been converted into purpose. There was no shame. She had made that determination early. This was not a reflection of her. This was a reflection of what the room had already decided before she walked through the door. She opened her eyes at 11:38. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Cruising altitude. Outside the oval window, the sky was the particular pale blue of high morning, not the theatrical blue of postcards, but the working blue of a place where weather operates, thin and serious and absolutely indifferent to whatever happened below it. She unzipped the tote bag. She did not remove her credentials. She removed instead the notebook, the current one, dark green with a cloth cover warped slightly at the bottom corner. She opened it to a blank page. She wrote, in the small, precise handwriting of years of cockpit notes, a TL to IAH deadhead. Row 31 redirected to 14, forward galley. What do you want to do? Below that, she wrote nothing for a long moment. The aircraft hummed around her, its own continuous low-register conversation with the air. The man in the window seat beside her was watching a movie on his phone with earbuds in, his shoulder angled toward the hull. Across the aisle, a mother was parceling crackers from a small zippered bag to a child of perhaps 4, who took each one without looking away from the animated figures on the seatback screen. She wrote, "Nothing is required of me. This is their aircraft until IAH. Then it is mine." Then she wrote, "But she would want to know if this is the room she blocked or the room she blocked you from." She looked at those two sentences for a moment. They were the same room. That was the point. She closed the notebook and slid it back into the tote bag. She was looking at the seatback pocket, at the laminated safety card tucked into it when the forward curtain moved and a tall man in uniform came through it. Not Marcus, not any flight attendant. The 4 stripes were on his epaulets before she registered the face, and the tablet in his hand was the operations issue kind, the kind used for manifest review, and he was reading it with the focused stillness of someone whose attention had been redirected mid-flight to a problem that had not been on the morning's briefing sheet. He was looking for a seat number. He moved past row 12, past row 13, his eyes going from the tablet to the seat numbers on the overhead bins and back. He reached row 14 and stopped. His eyes tracked from the tablet to her face and back to the tablet. Once, the quick return motion of a person confirming a fact they had not expected to be true. His name tag read, Captain D. Calloway. He said quietly, "Are you Adaisi Okafor?" She looked up at him. "Yes." The colour went out of the visible strip of his neck between the collar and his jaw in the way that happens when blood is being rerouted to process something urgent, not flushed, not sickened, but simply emptied. He had clearly been looking for a passenger to correct, to check on, perhaps to manage. He had found something else entirely. He said, "You're a captain, a 321. "I am," she said. Calloway stood with the tablet held at his side. His expression was not apologetic in the practiced airline representative way. It was not performing remorse. It was the face of a man running real-time calculations about what had happened on his aircraft, to whom and who among his crew had contributed to it, and in what specific way, and what his obligation was to the person sitting in seat 14C. Who had been laughed at in his forward galley for the last 45 minutes. "I'm going to ask you," he said, "to come forward. If you're willing." She looked at him for a moment without speaking. She did not make it easy. The pause was not theatrical. It was the honest pause of a person deciding whether the invitation is adequate to the offence. She had heard the laughter. She had moved from row 31. She had sat in the middle of a full economy section for 45 minutes, with the knowledge of who she was in her bag, unspoken, and she was not obligated to make anyone's discomfort smaller than it was. "I'll come forward," she said. She gathered the tote bag and stood. She followed him through the forward curtain without hurrying. The galley opened around her, and Marcus was at the forward station, and he saw her coming in the second before Calloway spoke. She watched the recognition arrive in his face in layers, the same way recognition always arrived when a person had made a confident error. First the factual correction, the repass of available data, then the social consequence of that correction, the awareness of what had been said in what company, then the stillness that comes when a person cannot find a quick path to where they need to be. Calloway said, "Marcus, she's crew, a 3-2-1 captain." He said it without emphasis or drama, the way you state a measurement, because the measurement is what matters. Marcus said nothing for a moment. His hand, which had been holding a service cup, set the cup down on the galley counter without glancing to find the counter. He found it by the same muscle memory that had been performing this job for years, and he set the cup on it carefully, and he looked at Adaize Okafor with the specific quality of attention he had not offered her at the gate. "I'll get you situated up front," he said. His voice had dropped the layer of performed pleasantness that had been present at boarding. What was underneath was quieter and more honest, and it cost him something to let it show. She stepped past him without comment. The flight attendant named Terry, the one who had done the overhead check in the main cabin, stood at the back edge of the galley. She was holding a service tray. She had heard everything said in the last 60 seconds. Her face held the specific expression of a person who is rearranging information they cannot unknow, and she did not speak, and Adaize did not look at her long enough to require a response. The cockpit door opened at Calloway's knock, and his first officer, a younger woman with close-cropped natural hair and 3 stripes at her shoulder, turned in her seat with the automatic alertness of an occupied cockpit, and then recalibrated when she saw the second uniformed captain standing in the doorway behind her own. Her name tag read F.O. Camille Watkins. She took in the situation in the way trained pilots take in new information, with the same neutral absorption they would apply to a revised weather picture: accept it, integrate it, proceed. Calloway said, "Captain Okafor, dead heading." The brevity was intentional, a statement of fact that required no additional architecture. Camille nodded once. Adaize nodded back. The jump seat folded down with its standard metallic click, and she settled into it. The cockpit was the standard A321 configuration. The same seat geometry and instrument layout she flew from the left seat of her own aircraft, and the familiarity of it settled around her like a change in pressure. This was her room. The fact that she had been redirected from 31 degrees Fahrenheit did not change what this room was, or what she knew about it. The Houston weather picture was presenting a cell to the south, visible on the radar as a green mass edging toward amber at its thickest section. She saw it before Calloway mentioned it. She watched him see it too and make the mental calculation about deviation, and she did not say anything because it was his aircraft and his calculation to make, and she had not been invited forward to offer opinions on flight management. She had been invited forward because a wrong had been done on this flight, and the captain was doing the only thing available to him at altitude, which was acknowledge the person who had been wronged and put her in the chair that was accurate to her rank. She listened to Camille work the radio with Houston Center, crisp and unhurried, the voice of someone who had done this long enough to be precise without effort. The phraseology was clean, no filler, no hesitation, the radio discipline of a pilot who had spent enough hours on frequency to have developed contempt for vague transmissions. Adaize noticed it, and noted it as she noticed any piece of competence she encountered, without comment, as information. She watched Calloway's instrument scan, heard it in the way pilots hear each other's scan rhythms, the slight pauses at each primary instrument, the pattern of a disciplined eye. He cross-checked the altimeter twice in 60 seconds near the altitude constraint, the habit of someone who had once been bitten by a setting error and had made a rule about it. She had the same habit for the same reason. She had picked it up from a check airman in her 3rd year on the 175 who had said, flatly, "Every altitude clearance gets 2 sets of eyes on the altimeter. No exceptions. The ones who get lazy are the ones who write incident reports." She had not written an incident report in 8 years of command. She thought of Nenna's porch, the radio 2 houses over playing something slow and brass-heavy. The question she had asked at 7 years old and the answer she had been handed, not as comfort, but as instruction. Learn every inch of the room from the outside so that when the blockage moves, you are the most prepared person waiting. She was sitting inside the room. The solution had worked. At 12:52, they crossed the Louisiana state line. The Gulf weather cell had drifted southeast, opening the direct routing. Calloway eased the heading back and the nose tracked toward Houston. He turned slightly in the seat, not enough to break his scan, but enough to speak and be heard. "You've been on the Air 321 how long?" he asked. 3 years in the left seat, she said. 2 years as first officer before that. Same type. He nodded. He said, "Good aircraft." "It is," she said. The weather cell to the south gave them a brief patch of moderate turbulence, 30 seconds of it, the kind that is unpleasant in economy and unremarkable in the cockpit. Calloway's hands moved through the correction without drama. A small input left, a second input to recover, the aircraft steady again in the time it takes to say it. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Then, 90 seconds later, off. Adais had looked at the radar when the cell first became relevant and had calculated the deviation option herself, quietly, without announcing it. Calloway had chosen the same corridor she would have chosen. She said nothing. It was his calculation. It was correct. He said, "Good call on the deviation." He had been watching her look at the radar. "I saw it 40 miles back," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I owe you an apology for what happened on boarding." "You weren't there for it," she said. "I was in command of it." She looked at the side of his face. He was not performing the apology. He was not making it theatrical or self-flagellating or uncomfortable in a way that would require her to manage his discomfort. He was simply stating the correct fact of command responsibility, the same fact she stated to herself when anything went wrong on her own aircraft. "It happened on my watch and under my authority, and I am accountable for it. It's noted," she said. "I don't need anything further from you on it." He nodded and returned to the instruments. The silence that followed was the working silence of two people who have resolved what needed resolving and are engaged in the task in front of them. They crossed the Texas border at 1311. The Gulf was visible as a haze on the southern horizon, the water invisible but present in the quality of the light, that particular flat glare that belongs only to coastal approaches. Adars had flown into Houston dozens of times, and she still noticed it each time, the way the light changed over the last 50 miles, the sky losing altitude in a specific way that no instrument ever fully captured. Descent planning began at 1320. Samuels. Calloway briefed the approach to Hobby in the efficient shorthand of someone with thousands of hours on the type. And she listened the way she listened to all briefings, not to evaluate but to learn, because the aircraft did not care whose hands were on it, and neither did the sky. And there was always something worth learning in another pilot's way of organising a descent. Camille set up the FMS, her fingers precise on the control panel. The altitude constraints loaded cleanly. The approach briefing completed. The checklist ran. They put the wheels down at William P. Hobby at 13:54, 2 minutes ahead of schedule. The landing was flat and clean. A crosswind of 11 knots from the right that Camille had corrected for on short final with a roll input that arrived exactly on time. The nose came down. The thrust reversers opened. The aircraft decelerated on the centerline without drama, the way a good landing always feels, like the aircraft had been intending to do this all along, and the pilots merely accompanied it. At the gate, the jetway extended, and Calloway walked with her to the forward door. Marcus was there. Terry was there, slightly back, her arms at her sides. Calloway did not speak. He stood slightly behind Adais as she faced the forward crew, and his standing there said, without words, everything that needed to be said about the weight of this moment. Marcus said, "Captain Okafor, I apologize for what happened at boarding." He said the full name. He said it correctly, all 5 syllables, Ada EZ, because he had read it on the manifest in the time since Calloway had come through the galley, and he had prepared to say it correctly. That much she registered. It cost her nothing to register it. "Consider it done," she said. She stepped off the aircraft and into the jetway. The jetway ended and the terminal opened around her, bright and loud with the ordinary work of an airport at the full pitch of midday. She walked through it at her pace, the tote bag on her shoulder, to the crew ready room at gate C14, and she signed in at 13:59 for her 14:40 departure to Denver. She opened the pre-flight package and began reading the weather. The airline placed a commendation on her file that following Tuesday, initiated by a gate operations supervisor at Hobby named Iris Fontaine, who had been working the adjacent gate and had observed the crew interaction in the jetway. Iris Fontaine was a 32-year airline employee, and she had written in her form, "I have been waiting a long time to write one of these." She spelled Adais correctly. She spelled Okafor correctly. She had asked the operations coordinator for the proper spelling and written it out in full the way you write a name when you have decided it deserves to be seen. Calloway submitted a separate incident report on the boarding handling of Deadhead crew. The report was factual and specific. It named the redirect, the galley conversation audible to a seated passenger, and the absence of any mechanism in the current boarding protocol that surfaced crew status before interaction. The report generated a review. The review produced a revised procedure. The procedure used language a person would have to work to misapply. Marcus attended a crew communications seminar voluntarily, not under instruction, 2 weeks after the flight. He did not tell his colleagues this. He mentioned it once to Terry in the break room at their base, in the same quiet tone in which people speak about things they are still processing. Camille Watkins sent Adaez a message through the company's internal system 9 days later. She was applying for her captain upgrade bid, she wrote. She had questions if the offer of connection stood. Adaez replied the same afternoon. It stands. They spoke for 42 minutes. Adaez answered every question directly and without softening the parts that were hard, because the hard parts were the parts that mattered, and Camille Watkins was not asking to be protected from them. She was asking to be prepared. The Denver flight that afternoon was ordinary in the way that flying becomes ordinary eventually, when you have done it enough to stop experiencing it as anything other than what it is, which is careful and constant work that rewards only preparation and punishes complacency, and that requires every single time the full weight of your attention. Adaez briefed her first officer. She reviewed the weather package, a ridge over Colorado producing light turbulence above flight level 350, that she noted and planned a deviation option for. She walked the aircraft. She settled into the left seat. The A321 lifts nose high at rotation, and she had never grown tired of the instant when the main gear breaks contact, when the aircraft is briefly neither on the ground nor in the air, and then commits, without qualification, to the air. She had been watching that instant from a shelf in Cincinnati since she was 7 years old. She had been building toward it in a commissary and on a milk crate, and in a testing center and a simulator for 19 years after that. She had been building toward it in the name of a woman who had stood at a fence at Lunken Airport in 1961 and memorized the sound of engines and come home and decided that the blocked door was a different problem from a locked door. The runway let go. The aircraft committed. She flew. That night, in a hotel room with a window facing the Rockies, she called her mother. Her mother asked about the day. Adaez said it had been a long one. Her mother asked if she was all right. Adaez said she was better than all right. Her mother, who knew her daughter and knew the shape of that particular phrasing, said only, "Good." In Cincinnati, in a house with yellow-tiled kitchen and a listing back porch, on a shelf in the living room that held exactly 3 things. A hand-painted model, 737 sat at the angle you set a model at when you want it to look like it is already moving, already past the reluctance of the ground, already in conversation with the air it was always intended to inhabit. Beside it, in a small wooden frame, Adaez had made herself from scrap lumber when she was 15, was a piece of paper with 41 names written in a nurse's careful cursive. At the bottom, in the same hand, were 2 words, 42. There is something the aviation industry does not say clearly when it talks about its diversity initiatives and its pipeline numbers and its stated commitments to representation. It doesn't say we have required exceptional people to build their qualifications in exceptional isolation, without the professional networks and mentorship structures that have always operated for others as a matter of course. It does not say the credential gap we point to as evidence of pipeline problems is itself the product of systems that made the pipeline inaccessible for decades. It does not say the women who arrived at the left seat anyway did so by carrying the knowledge their grandmothers should have been able to use, and by building in commissaries and on milk crates and in night school ground school programs with second-hand materials, a competence that the industry then pretends it had no reason to expect. What Adayezi Okafor carried onto that aircraft was not an exceptional story. It is a recurring one. And the distance between seat 14C and the left seat of a captain's cockpit is not a talent gap. It is a visibility gap. It is the distance between who the room has been organised to see and who has been standing there, fully prepared, for years. If you are reading this from a room that keeps looking past you, hold this. The room's sight is not your credential. Your preparation is. What they see is their limitation. What you know is your authority. The door that is blocked is not locked, and you are already learning every inch of what is inside. One day, someone in that room will read your name on the manifest. Watch what happens to their face and carry on flying. Share this with someone who has been sitting in row 14 longer than they should have. Not just so they feel seen, though they will, because they deserve to know the room is already running out of ways not to see them.